Welcome, .NET friends all around the world. You know what time it is. This is the On.NET Live Show, where our mission is to empower you, the .NET community, to achieve more. I'm your host, Scott Addy, with co-hosts David Pine and Cam Soper. Today's guest, Dennis Doomen, joins us to talk about unit testing, a topic that is very near and dear to our hearts. Welcome to the show, Dennis. It's great to have you on today.
Thank you. It's an honor, and I like the way you pronounce my last name.
So it's a good thing we had this pre-show call, because I would have absolutely butchered that last name without your assistance. So thank you for that. I'd like to just kick off the show. Dennis, could you briefly introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, sure. I've been in the .NET space for, I guess, from the start, 20,000 or something like that. Before that, I was a programmer mostly in C++. My first programming experience was on the Commodore 64 using BASIC and Simon's BASIC. And I think for the last 12, 13 years, I've been pretty active in open source development. And I sometimes talk about my topics at conferences, different places, inside and outside my hometown, the Netherlands, or my home country, the Netherlands.
Very good. So you heard it. We'll hear more from Dennis later on in the show, but first we'd like to get into our Related Bits segment.
Hello, friends. I'm going to be sharing the Related Bits section today. And the document that we've prepared or wanted to share with you specifically is unit testing best practices with .NET. So if you're unfamiliar with unit testing, that's okay. Just know that it's very important to do. And this article covers, some of the reasons why it's important. Specifically, it's, less time performing functional tests, or manual testing and things of that nature. It helps to protect against regressions. And my favorite is you can consider it executable documentation. So for me personally, I actually learned the most when adopting a new API by reading that library's unit tests, because it kind of lets you know how it's expected to be used in kind of, pseudo real scenarios, isolating a unit of an API and exercising, expected or well-known inputs and evaluating the outputs. So this covers like various characteristics of a good unit test. You want them to be fast, isolated, repeatable, self-checking, and timely. I think timely and fast is probably redundant, but code coverage is also important to an extent. A lot of people fixate on code coverage. So I think this is a good blurb to have in this article. To me, code coverage is just another way to look at how you're, covering the various aspects of your APIs. And again, some people get really hung up on it and strive for 100%. I don't think 100% is realistic, or is it extremely valuable. Just knowing that you're writing unit tests is, I think, a great first step, especially if you're unfamiliar with them. So the section that says, let's speak the same language, this is just really talking about all the different terminology, because there's a lot of different terminology that gets thrown around out there, such as, fakes or mocks or stubs and things of that nature, along with various reputable patterns such as arrange, act, and assert. And then this article also dives into some best practices with real world examples of what to do, why to do it that way, and what's bad and what's better and things of that nature. So I encourage you to check it out.
David, that article looks really well written. It looks like it, it goes into the theory and why you want to do it and everything. Did you write that article?
I did not. This was actually written by John Reese, and special thanks to Roy Osherov.
Wow. Yeah.
But it's lots of people have contributed to it, so it's been a living document for a long time.
I'm glad that David called out the code coverage aspect. I'm of the belief that at a certain point, you've reached the point of diminishing returns. If it's your goal to always achieve 100% code coverage, that's kind of where I step back and ask myself, was that extra effort really worth it to get from, say, 95% to the 100% figure?
And I think there's also like a turning point too that's often missed, is once you start kind of bending over backwards, so to speak, to making all these extra gyrations to get that additional, say 5 or 10% of coverage, then you're typically doing things that are fragile with your tests, such that as you start to change and evolve your code or refactor things, now you're spending more time updating those, extra weird cases that were not really something that's necessary, I believe. But yeah, I think one of the key benefits is really just to help you as a developer refactor code faster with the assurances that, hey, this is, working the way it still should work.
It's interesting because I never read that article, but you just scrolled through it and already saw a couple of things which I don't entirely agree with. So
that's good. That's good. So you can this is open source. So we're always open to collaborating with people around the community.
Yeah.
So Dennis, I would strongly encourage you to read through this and hit the little edit button up here, right here. And that'll take you to the GitHub repo with the markdown file that is, behind this, and send us a pull request and we'll talk through it, and we can get the original authors involved as well. Let's have an open debate about it. Let's make this better for everyone.
That makes sense.
And that goes for everybody. Just a reminder, all of our documentation for .NET is open source. We accept public contributions. So if you see something that you disagree with, send us a PR and we'll start the conversation.
Cool. You'll send the link in the show notes or something like that, right?
Yes.
Did
we did not scroll that? We didn't share it, did we?
We didn't. It's been a while since I've been on one of these streams, and I've completely forgotten my job here. So, yeah, that URL on the bottom. Yeah, sorry about that, folks. My bad.
No worries. And Roy Sharoff is well known for his book. Indeed, it's just being mentioned in the comments. Art of Unit Testing. But about code coverage is interesting because if you look at Fluent Assertions, the open source project that I'm maintaining together with Jonas Nierep has 96% coverage. And the reason for that is because we practice test-driven development. And yeah, that is something, I'm very careful to call any pattern or principle or technique as the ultimate solution. But the last 15 years I've been practicing test-driven development, and it really makes sense to me. The fact that your tests become your documentation, become the example of how you should use something or what kind of behavior you can expect. And that's also something that Fluent Assertions is trying to do. That our own unit tests are supposed to be documentation of how to use the library. In fact, quite often if somebody asks me like, how would you do this with the library? I have to go through the test and see, what was that syntax that we supported for that? And just give a link to the code for that.
That's really awesome that you said that, because again, that was my shared sentiment. Is I've literally learned so many APIs by studying the unit tests that were written for that
Yeah.
code. So
Same.
It's not, and you see the examples that you may not know of, or documentation doesn't talk about, or it's the behavior that you, like you're calling an API and you see something happening which you didn't entirely expect, and then you can go to the test and actually find similar cases and come to the conclusion that that's exactly what it's supposed to do, or not at all, which is interesting. In fact, if somebody reports an issue with the library, one of the first things we do is to create a test to see if we can reproduce that behavior. And for us, that almost means like, hey, we've actually missed the scenario. We've not been as dogmatic as we may want to be about practicing TDD all the time. And that's totally fine, by the way, because it's a real project, and real projects are not dogmatic. They sometimes have to take a trade-off or accept some technical debt. It's also interesting that I see the naming conventions. I don't like that either.
yeah, I don't like the underscore in the name, right?
I actually like that.
Oh, I don't. Already,
many,
come on, Dennis.
as many people with so many different opinions. No, I was a big proponent of the when something happens, it should be.
Like a scenario based?
Yeah, but
Okay.
well, not. I don't want to call it BDD style, but basically, but like
But that
over
seems
the time,
BDD, right? Like that's. I mean, that's kind of the like when you say when, that's defining a scenario, no?
yes, but if you give that example of, can you show me? Scroll it up. Maybe we can use that as an example to talk about. Like this was saying, which was better? Add single number, return same number. Yeah, it's not even bad. It's probably the naming convention I don't like, with the combination of Pascal casing and underscores.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't like the underscore.
But I saw people actually add the name of the method in the function in the test name. I think that's a bad practice, because if names of methods change, then your tests don't make sense. They should be functional. So I really put a lot of emphasis on making the names, keeping the names functional.
Interesting.
As much as possible. Yeah.
I like that.
And but still as short as possible, obviously, because you don't want noise. And that's why I don't like the when something it should be do something, because the names are very long.
Right.
You're looking for a good example, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to see if I can quickly find a when in the. I'm not seeing anything.
But if you talk about code coverage, one of the things I often tell clients and other people in my community is that it should never be used as a KPI or something that your manager will use against you. And whether your goal is 90%, 80%, 95%, that's up to you. I do think that if you run into a code base which has like 50% coverage, then I'm starting to frown, like, okay, what's going on there? Are we missing something? Is there maybe another layer of testing, like end-to-end testing using the UI or some HP level testing that we're missing? Or are we really not covering that much? And I sometimes give a masterclass on writing maintainable and testable code. And one of the reasons that I give at the beginning is that as a developer, you want to have confidence that when you change the code, you didn't break anything, because what's the worst thing you can do? You fix something on the left side and something on the right side breaks. I think that's the value of your tests, or one of the values of the test, the safety net. That we have 96%. Is a little bit because we have some contributors that really cared about it, and they started to use what is it called, property-based testing or something? No, property-based testing. There's this testing technique that tries to change your code to see if you miss some scenarios. I forgot the name. Maybe it'll pops up later on.
Okay.
But they use the tool. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think it would be super interesting to add a poll to this doc and just gauge kind of what does the community think, the pattern should be, or the convention should be for naming a unit test method. I think we'd find that we've basically approached the same thing as the tabs versus
Sure.
Well, and certainly a good bellwether for that is, if we're looking in the chat for the stream right now, we've already got a lively discussion going on about naming conventions and code coverage, and so this is a topic that folks are pretty passionate about, just like tabs and spaces and dark IDE versus light IDE, and
that's not even a debate. That's been settled. And in fact, the light theme on David's page right now is quite disturbing.
I did that on purpose because I knew you were going to be co-hosting.
Well, why don't we move on to the hallway track, and I'll try to find some Visine to cover my eyes. This light theme is awful. All right, so we've entered what we call the hallway track. We try to recreate the experience you'd get at a physical, in-person software development conference when you're in between sessions and you encounter those groups of people that are talking about super interesting things, like, for example, how to name a unit test. But we have our guest Dennis with us today. Dennis, what did you come to the show to share with us today?
It's a good question. I care about writing maintainable and testable code in general. So I try to make my test readable. I try to make my test self-explanatory, and that driving force led me to come up with a little library called Fluent Assertions, which I created together with a colleague, Martin Obdam, 12 years ago, which is about to hit 200 million downloads.
Whoa!
And
that's quite a few.
That's quite a few, which I never anticipated would happen. Never can even imagine. Which doesn't mean that I know what I'm talking about, because some people like to think like, oh, Dennis is the author of Fluent Assertions, so he must know what he's talking about. Of course I'm not. I've built my own experiences. I shot myself in the foot more times than I can count, and I've started to build up my own opinions about how you should write your tests.
Awesome.
And I
so
thought that might be a great topic. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's a really good kind of introduction to the topic as a whole. So I'm familiar with Fluent Assertions. I've used it before. Could you define for our live viewers around the world, what does it mean to be fluent, and what does that like? And from a high level view, we all know how to write unit tests, but what does it mean to be fluent?
It's a Fluent API, which was a thing that was very popular for a while. Some people frown upon, and it's just a way where methods return an instance of the class, and because of that, you can chain all the methods together. If you look at link in C#, and then specifically the extension methods, the select and the wheres and that kind of stuff, that's a Fluent API, for example. If you use the test data builder pattern, which is very popular in unit testing, it's also a pattern that heavily relies on Fluent APIs. I think
the
there's a lot
builder
of
pattern
libraries.
is based on that too, right? Yep.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And I don't know, some people hate it. I love it. Being able to chain things together and only, use the elements that are important. And I started to use it, and yeah, since then it's still there.
Love it.
Yeah.
So do you think there's a benefit to using Fluent as an API like design approach versus not?
The Fluent pattern or the library we're talking about?
Yeah, not the library specifically. I know there's probably bias there, right? Because there's nearly 200 million, and you wrote it, right? So I'm saying like that pattern. Now that it's been out there for over a decade, you could tie it back to your library specifically, but how do you feel about that as like a conceptual pattern for writing code?
I still like it because instead of calling like the subject or the class instance dot do something, another one is more like it's a really concise way of expressing what you're trying to do. And the risk, and that's actually the direction we took. At some point, you end up creating almost like a language. I just like it. I don't know what it is. And some people said we don't like it because it's difficult to debug, but that's not an issue anymore. IDEs completely understand how to step through the different parts. And I think even Visual Studio now gives you the return value if you jump from one to the other. For me, it's so natural to write that. And yeah, it's love or hate. I don't know.
Do you think we should share your screen now so that
Sure.
do we have something to look at?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you can see here like a unit test which is trying to compare two objects. In this case, it's comparing an object subject, which is some DTO object, against nil, and it's saying that those two should be equivalent. and this is writer, so that's why you see all these little things in between. But it's basically saying that your subject should be equivalent to nil, and it should be nil, which is maybe a bit superfluous. And this should not throw. Well, it's Fluent. Um, Nothing more to say about it. The more complicated examples, yeah, I think we have some, like with and which constructs or something, and which are being used. I'm jumping through the code base, of course, looking for tests that are doing that. Oh, sorry, not this one. There's lots of tests here, somewhere here. You see, for example, here, like this action here should throw an action unit exception with a specific message. And again, I also am convinced you shouldn't check too much of the exception message. So you can use wildcards, for example, here. And if it doesn't do that, you're supposed to get really clear messages. That's one of the reasons. Like, I think Jeremy D. Miller, maybe you know that from the Al.NET community, once said, like, you should keep out of the debugger hell. And the point is that if your test fails, you really don't want to avoid situation that you have to attach a debugger, find out where it fails. The message should be clear enough. Of course, this is a pretty complicated example, but if you look at the simpler ones, let's say this is, I don't know, this is a new sum DTO. I think I should be able to run it in my test case. Can I? Probably I should. I'm using the presentation here. I should jump out of the, oh, there it is. It's a bit big with the big fonts. It's compiling everything. See, did not expect any exception, but found an action unit exception with this message. Expected subject to be null, but found some more detailed thing. So that kind of things you get. You can also compare collections. You see, for example, two collections, even collections with nested collections, and you can compare them. And this is a very popular feature of Fluent Assertions, to be able to compare graphs, because that happens a lot. Like you read some API returns you a JSON, you deserialize that JSON to some anonymous object, and then in your test you want to verify whether the response is correct.
And
there's a lot of
that must be entirely value-based comparison semantics rather than reference, right?
It's actually pretty complicated. This is one of the features that over the years became too powerful, I would even say. But it's smart enough to know that if your expectation is anonymous type, it will only expect those two properties to exist. So in this case, you're comparing collections. Mm-hmm. So by default, it assumes like, oh, that's a collection. A collection is typically unordered, so it will just not check the ordering. It will just say, as long as these objects are comparable. But now the question is, I'm actually comparing collections of nested objects with some other collections underneath. Well, this is where the complicated stuff happens. And then you probably need to know, most people don't use this kind of complexity. Like it's even going further, like it should be equivalent, but for this particular, if the parent of this thing is a particular type, then the order is important. Well, to give you an indication, there is tons of options that you can choose here to change the way it should be working. And that's just this is the be equivalent to it. Of course, we have much simpler examples. You can also compare simple primitives like date only. Switch to .NET 6 because basically comparing dates. Yeah, nothing to it. You just want to be able to say one should be the same as the other one. And there's some nice tricks. For example, we often use a construct. Where is it? Jumping around. Sorry. Because we didn't, of course, prepare the demos, but we have something like December. This one, it's a bunch of extensions to be able to say something like the date time should be the 10th of December of 2011. Well, you know then when the test was written actually. At that particular time with so many milliseconds. So you can easily compare date times in a more fluent, this is again a fluent syntax. And then you can say the date time microseconds should be this value.
So we have we've got a question here. So Wayne is asking, why is the test called a fact?
That's because we're using XUnit here. And XUnit's way of marking a unit test is, or a test is using a fact. It also has a theory, which you can use to pass a bunch of different values in your test, to parameterize the test. By the way, if people have not actually read the book XUnit Patterns, which has nothing to do with the library, it's a brilliant book about patterns, how to make your code more testable, especially if the code wasn't designed for testability. And if I may, same can be said about the book. It's called, I think it's called Working Effectively with Legacy Code by Michael Fetters, which is a book where the examples are mostly in C++, but it's still very actual. It really shows you how to deal, like strategies. Like I have this legacy code base. I came in to make it more testable. How can you decompose, create seams, build a kind of a safety net, a temporary safety net? It's really cool. Nothing to do with Fluent Assertion. It's just,
that's awesome.
It's one of those things. Yeah.
I think I would need Visine for that. I know Scott mentioned that before. C++.
Dennis, along the same lines, we had a question a little bit earlier from our very frequent viewer, Jose, who wanted to know which unit test framework you prefer. I mean, obviously these tests are written in XUnit, but I believe Fluent Assertion supports pretty much all of them, right?
All of them. The reason why we are using XUnit is purely for historical reasons. We used to be using MS-Test, MS-Test 1 when everything was still run sequentially. I then came in contact with XUnit where all your tests run in parallel, and Fluent Assertion has about 6,000 unit tests, but we support like 6 different targets, so that's 25,000 unit tests. You want to run them as quickly as possible, so I have a 14-core machine, so I want to benefit from that. And MS-Test didn't do that in the past. I think MS-Test 2 is doing that. I have actually looked at NUnit a couple of times, wondering whether I should switch, but in the end, it doesn't really matter. It's just whatever you used. In the past, I would have said don't use MS-Test, but of course, yeah, it also became better.
Have you considered perhaps using all three to kind of diversify how your tests run on your like CI and whatnot to kind of help ensure? I mean, it's not like it would really change the underlying things. Oh, okay, never mind.
We actually do. I mean, not the whole suite, but we have a bunch of tests to make sure that Fluent Assertion properly handles the specific exception types that the different libraries throw. Yeah, indeed. So you see mspec, nspec, XUnit, NUnit, and MS-Test v2. Yeah.
Love it. Awesome.
But there's no real pros and cons. It's just use whatever you want to use and stick with it. That's generally the idea we're having here, because it's very difficult to keep your code base consistent.
So let's talk about your method naming conventions again. I know that we talked about it conceptually before, but now that I'm seeing it, I don't like it.
Actually, I don't like it either anymore. I used to like it. No, so I think it's a bit verbose.
I learned a new term today, thanks to viewer Fuel Snable, snake case. I'd never heard snake case before, and I'm guessing that's where you capitalize the first letter and then everything else is lowercase.
I think it is, yeah. Well, I don't like. I mean, if you read text, like written text, it's not like every word is written with a capital first character letter. Of course,
that's true. That's true. I'm just giving you a hard time.
No, but it's a bit verbose, but it's still it's still a fully phrased functional description of what is expected. But it's a bit verbose. I was looking for the examples because recently we started to introduce a new terminology which is a bit more concise. It's still English. Okay, so it's not entirely snake case.
Right.
Actually, I don't even care what it's called.
Yeah. No, since it starts with a capital, I don't think it's formally a snake case. So the line 131, it says, when fluently specifying a date and time, it should return the correct date time value. So to me, we're testing it, but what is it? That's kind of my concern with this.
So the context of this class are the Fluent datetime specs.
So that's where I was going to get. That's what I was getting to. So the functions themselves don't stand alone. They're contextual to the class that they are
exactly
within. Okay.
Yeah. And recently I was looking for an example while we were talking. I couldn't quickly find it, but we even started to. So first of all, what I like now, but I need to look up for example, is this should be a lot smaller, because quite often the fact that when fluently specifying a date in January, this part is actually unnecessary, because that should be clear from the whole scope that we're testing this fluent, we're testing this thing. So it should be much smaller. Probably can be something like can specify a month or something in that context would be enough. Like can express a month in fluent style or something. I don't know.
Right.
Sometimes that would probably be clear enough, or maybe even given the context, can express a month.
So one thing that earlier in my career, there was a lead engineer, team lead, and she was very adamant about. She actually taught algorithms in C# at MSOE, which is Milwaukee School of Engineering. So she's a brilliant lady. She hated the comments in unit tests because to her they were so redundant, like the arrange, act, assert. So what's your stance on having those repeated everywhere? And they're even inconsistent in spots, right? Because right here, the arrangement would really be.
There's no arrange. So why would I specify? No, this is the act.
Yeah. So I'm saying like.
Yeah, true. So in this case, I think it's not absolutely necessary. It's more for consistency reasons that we do it, to help people remind, like, but we have some more complicated tests, obviously, where it could be useful. But yeah, it's purely a taste thing. I mean, some people like it, so there's no real reasons for doing it. I like it because I deal a lot with legacy code bases, and there, being able to understand, like in this big, this 60-line unit test, automated test, where a lot of stuff is happening, trying to stand where it's not even obvious where the subject on the test is, because there's also base classes and private methods and constructors that do all kinds of magic. It really helps. And this is I've been hurt by a lot of legacy code bases in my career. I'm doing this now professionally for 26 years.
Yeah.
I start to value these kind of things. As I said, I shot myself in the foot. I saw other people shoot themselves in the foot. So I kind of persist on this kind of stuff. And yeah, again, I try to use Fluent Assertions also as an example.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a good point. So I agree that like with legacy code, it's totally relevant, especially when you have larger things that you're arranging and you want to dissect, and make sense of the code. But for me, I've always personally tried to avoid comments when they're like obvious or.
Yeah, wondering if I have really bad example of a long test. I would have to dig through the code. There's so many tests. That's why I don't know this stuff by heart. Probably some of the data table things. Oh no, there's also pretty clear. No, not that bad actually. They're all pretty small. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's just something I was curious about.
Yeah. It's purely personal preference.
So while we're on the topic of that trio of A's, arrange, act, assert, let's focus on the assert section just for now. My question is, what's your rule of thumb, your personal opinion on the number of assertions per method? Should there be one assertion per method, or do you allow yourself in some cases to have multiple assertions? And then based on your answer, why is that?
So I know that this can be a heated debate. I generally follow the single assertion per test because I want every test case to be about one thing. However, sometimes you cannot express that in a single assert, and in those cases, I actually combine that, and to still make it possible. Like I don't know, this example doesn't make sense, but if I would do something like data table should not, I don't know, not be of type, I don't know, data table, something stupid. There's nothing wrong with that. The only issue is if indeed it's not of the right type, this one will fail and that one will never execute. And so it's more like a rule of thumb. Some people actually do this trick: surround with using new assertion scope, which is a fluent assertion trick. You can do this, and this will make sure that both test cases will, both assertions will be executed, and they will fail as one. So you still get that point. But yeah, you know, in my experience, if you need multiple assertions, especially when you do something, you have an act, then you assert, you then do another act, and then an assert. Those I tend to break down into individual test cases, because quite often it's just people being lazy, trying to get as much logic in that test, but it doesn't really make that test more readable. And I see that. And you really have to scan the test case to understand, like, what happens. Oh, this is an act. Oh, now it's modifying the subject in the test again. I don't like that. Then I really would like to break it down to smaller parts. However, sometimes you see code that is more orchestrational, like some subject that interacts with the different things. Then I usually use a more BDD style test. And I use a different library like Chill or MSpec, where you have more like the given, when, then constructs, where you actually have so one action actually results in multiple separate things, which you also want to give a name. Example of that, probably look up that, I'll look it up on the fly. Where's the Chill BDD? I'm looking for examples. In the meantime, yeah, I like this one. Oh, can you see the code? Go away. Ads. Let's make it a bit bigger. So you have a test case when retrieving an existing customer. Then you have the given, and in the given you actually set up a customer. You call this is the get, and you expect that two things happen: the view is returned, and the model is the existing customer, which is like test cases more like related to model view, model MVVM. And here you basically have two assertions. Technically, you could just put that on one method, just as we saw before. But in this case, you actually make it explicit because you want to name what is expected to happen. And then it makes sense. But this is very, very useful if you have orchestrational code, like controllers that interact with different things, or presenters if you use the model view presenter MVP pattern. So I actually use both patterns whenever that makes sense. I just don't mix them, because the subject on the test is actually more state-based, and then the range act assert makes sense to me. And if it's more orchestrational, I switch to a different pattern.
Interesting. So we've talked a lot about different concepts and best practices and argued different perspectives. I'm actually really curious now about your API specifically. So as it relates to Fluent Assertions. Mm-hmm. So can you just start typing, for example, like data table dot, and I'm curious, when does Fluent Assertions pick up versus, so does it start with should, and then from that it chains off?
Always should.
Should, okay.
So should itself is an extension method, and from there on, yeah, you see be equivalent, have column, have columns. So these are specific extensions or specific assertions for data tables. And by the way, I don't use data tables myself anymore, but you get a lot of generic ones. Be assignable, be of type, be same, not be signable. Sometimes you can also chain them. Like you can say this should be of be of type data table, obviously. And sometimes you can even say which, and then you get an instance of the data table itself, which you can then do something like this: should be, or should, I don't know, have columns. So you can chain them together.
Okay.
But it's always should, whatever you have.
So should is an extension method from your library that returns what type?
It returns, depending on the source type, This is a data table string. It returns a class. I think they're called assertions, but you don't typically see them. That has a specific methods. So if I would define a string, foo is hello.net, and I do should, you can actually see that it returns string assertions, which is its own set, which has a lot of different things like contain equals, be empty.
Okay.
See, match regex. So
Got
it's
it.
different.
Got it.
The B equivalent is always there. You can always use B equivalent anywhere because that's the one that allows you to compare entire graphs. If you would
Got it.
define a dictionary, I don't know, dictionary of string.object,
Mhm.
foo is new, then again, you will have something like foo, and then you can say it should satisfy, it should contain key, it should contain a particular value, have count, intersections, not contain. There's so much there.
So how
Because, yeah,
many like base assertions classes are there then?
who? I think they all inherit from reference type or reference type assertions. Jumping through the code base, which is
Yeah.
not going to be quite a lot actually. Assembly for data column, delegate exception, generic collections for reflection, stream strings types, even X document and .NET XML, async, a lot of stuff for async support. The thing is, the library exists for 12 years, and yeah, as I
So
said,
it
I'm
keeps
very
growing.
happy. It
Yeah.
keeps growing. Like, I don't actually need anything new anymore, but it's the contributors that ask for new features. And sometimes, yeah, you HTTP response, you can even, and this is also what makes it more difficult to maintain something. I put a tweet out last week, like sometimes it's also about educating the contributors because yeah, it's quite a burden for us, me and Jonas, to maintain all of this. So you also have to think about what do we actually want to be a part of the library these days. If people propose a feature, we even have like a little bit of a review procedure. We mark it as a proposed API. We get some feedback from the community because yeah, 200 million downloads means that you have to actually think about it. It comes with great responsibility, which I didn't realize. You don't want to introduce breaking changes, but also consistency. If you want to be able to say that an async, a func async should complete within the amount of time, then you also need to have a method that it should not complete within it something. All of that you have to start thinking about.
So I saw event assertions, and I'm curious, what does that look like?
Event specs. That's basically here. Like you have a subject, a subject which is a class that has a event. Here, like property
Yep.
changed or more the traditional ones.
Yes,
Which
or like
normally,
an actual action delegate. I like it.
yeah, like the ones from the past.
Yep.
And then you can say I want to monitor it, and at the end you say it should raise this event.
Oh, so this isn't interesting. So this it starts with monitor, but it still has the should.
Yes.
Okay.
That's the reason. In the past, we used some magic that you just call monitor on it, and it would do this in the background, but it relied
Sure.
on statics and state, and that doesn't work anymore in the current async world. So at some
Right.
point, we had to actually use basically it's a using block. So what this returns is a monitor class which is disposable, which at some point
Yep.
also tells you to stop monitoring. This works much better in async code.
Yes.
Even has, I think there's probably raise property change specific ones. Like she should raise property change 4.
Yep. Yep.
I don't use those myself a lot these days, but I'm not doing a lot of WPF or
Sure.
Maui. But I guess that's very, very interesting for those people. Yeah.
We do have a question here. Is there an async static, perhaps?
There
or like thread static?
There is a no. In this case, it's not because you're actually creating an instance here. It doesn't create static. The assertion scope thing does do that under the hood, indeed. But yeah, what is his name? Fully Snabble. Check out the code. Everything is open. Yeah. And it's also very extensible. I mean, if you look at the documentation, we have an entire section how you can build your own extension. So it has been designed for that. So you can actually build your own shoots to support your own library. We do that a lot in my client projects. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff there. Collections also very popular, of course. You already saw the unordered things. Yeah, there's so many. I mean, if you only look at the number of test cases in this particular file, nested dictionaries that even supports it. And this thing, I often use that to also talk about design patterns. This B equivalent to looks like a simple method, but it's actually an entire engine that has been built over the years. Started very simple, but then now we have it's even pluggable now because there's so many different needs. And that surprised me actually over time. There's so many different needs. People are trying to do things which we didn't even imagine they would be doing with the library.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So what's next for this project?
That's a good question. I've actually said a couple of times that it's feature complete, but for some reason people don't agree. Me and Jonas are actually having a hard time keeping up with the number of pull requests and requests for features. And the good thing is we get more contributors, more pull requests. We also established more coding standard rules and try to describe better what kind of things we expect. We use, for example, emojis in pull request reviews to emphasize like which things in my pull request review are important and which not. We also discovered that we need to restructure the code. We started grouping tests using nested classes to group related test cases together because there's so many test cases, it becomes almost unwieldy at some point. I mean, if you go through the whole list, 22,552 unit tests. That's a lot. That's of course because we support multiple frameworks, but you need to structure that at some point. See,
and how long does it take to execute
this?
Yeah,
I don't know. I just got a new machine. I have no clue how long it runs. I think a couple of minutes.
Okay. I was curious if it, just like the general range, a couple seconds, couple minutes.
No, a couple of minutes for the whole suite, of course. But
right.
Usually now it has all the targets. But normally, of course, I've actually made a mess out of my repo because of the examples, which I can actually clean up in the background and then see if I can build this thing. It depends. The multi-targeting is the problem here, of course, because we target 6 different libraries of six different. Okay, actually builds. So we can try. See what it does. 22,007. Okay, here it goes. So you can actually see this is the number of tests that run in parallel. And this is an i5 CPU, 13 generations. So quite a lot actually. Did it complete? Yeah, it completed, I think.
Yeah, it looks like it's done.
Yeah, that's pretty fast. I think it skipped. Yeah, it skipped here. I think it skipped a target framework because I don't have the framework installed.
Sure. But it ran in on just under 5 seconds. It looks like.
That's quite fast actually. I didn't expect that. But usually I select one target framework and then I run them. Oh, I haven't even tried that on my new machine. It's pretty fast. Probably in a year when I have all the tools installed, it gets slower, but it's quite fast. Yeah.
Awesome.
So Dennis,
like that.
for the viewers out there, I'm seeing some chatter out here about how do you get started with Fluent Assertions. For that beginner audience who hasn't used the library before, are there any good resources you would recommend for getting started with it?
It's actually pretty simple. You create a test project like this one, and well, depending which IDE you're using, I think I haven't tried that, but I think if I do something like string foo is hello, and I do something like shoot, no, it doesn't work that. I have seen that actually happen that writer would find it. No, you just add the Fluent Assertions project to it. Fluent Assertions, it's here. You add it. I don't use Visual Studio myself anymore, so I don't even know what it looks like these days. But that should be enough, and then you can get going. You have all your methods. Yeah, it's not a very complicated library. If you want to read up of it, yeah, you go to the repo of the documentation here, the website fluentassertions.com, and there is this documentation section where you can find for different types all the examples, like basic assertions. You see all the examples that we have. dictionaries. If you want to use the object graph, the equivalent, which is much bigger. It talks about recursion, how it deals with value types and reference types, records, how you can influence that, conversion, goes quite far. But yeah, for us, the documentation is also generated from the same pull request. So whenever somebody contributes a pull request, they have to make sure the release notes are up to date and the documentation has to be extended. So they're always in sync. I think that's a good start. But yeah, it's a simple library. You just start using it and you use it in whatever you want to use. It should be empty and then you just run it. That should be enough. And then you get your message. Expected food to be empty, but found hello. Yeah, that's it. You don't need anything more.
We do have a question here about asynchronous calls being invoked via Fluent Assertions. They're saying, is there any possibility to wait explicitly until some async calls need to be invoked via Fluent Assertions?
If it's being invoked, are they actually saying something like, I have this task method, bool, foo, which returns at some point task yield, what is it, from result? And that you can say foo, sorry, you can do something like func, no, what is it?
Func of task? No.
Yeah, you have multiple ways of saying. I think you can do something like invoking. It's an extension method. I don't know by heart what's the name is, but normally you do like func of task. Act is foo. Does that compile? No, that doesn't compile.
It needs to be a task of bool inside the func.
Ah, yeah, of course.
Or just var, well, the whole thing.
Oh, yeah. No, you can't do that. Ah, wait. And then it has to be, I think, like that. Let's say foo. And then you should be able to say shoot. No, wait. We're making it too complicated now. Shoot. Ah, yeah. And then you have not throw async and complete within async and after async, throw async. And then you can say it should throw and then it will actually wait for it.
Oh, so it awaits. You don't need to have like an async returning.
Yeah. It's async internally. So it's async all the way. In the past, we actually blocked the call, but these days we don't do that. So throw async will actually await your task for you.
So what does throw async return? A task, hopefully.
Yes, you have to actually do it like this.
Right. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Yep. That's what I was expecting.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, indeed. And then you have to quote. Yeah, that's what it should be doing. Yeah. Your IDE will actually warn you. I think it even, yeah, see, it's already complaining. Like it's saying that, see, it's not awaited, execution will not happen. Yeah, that's the way it should be. But there's also a way, I think it's called invoking. I haven't used that myself. It's a Fluent Assertion thing. What is it called? To make it more fluent thing. Invoking. Here, there's the func. Awaiting. Yeah, that's the one I was looking for. So here you see, this is a task factory, so something that returns a task. You can actually say awaiting this call should not. So instead of creating a func, you can use awaiting to chain a lot of things together. But that's more styling, whatever you prefer.
Interesting.
Yeah, to make it more fluent. You see that? See this factory awaiting, this timer delay should not complete. Yeah, you can go quite far with that. I'm not saying it's always going to be as readable as it should be. But here, by the way, I do use arrange act, which kind of helped because there's already a lot of stuff happening here. I might actually help you understand what's happening.
Coming full circle back to the comments out
there.
Yeah. So I see that that's a task completion source.
Yeah.
Why do we have to explicitly cast the task, like return task, t task? Isn't t.task already a task?
I think because it's an old task, because we even have specialized shoots for task completion source these days. Task factory shoot complete within. See, we have specialized now. It's something like a very old test case. That hasn't
Okay.
been updated. Yeah. Some of these tests are quite complicated to follow, actually. To be fair, because I haven't seen this like a long time. I would have to analyze that. By the way, you do see the milliseconds thing again to create a time span.
So
Yeah.
those extension methods, are those just like extensions to int32 or?
Which one? Oh, those, yes. They are. Look, int milliseconds. Yeah. But I like that because in this case, for me, a unit test, I have this golden rule, I call it, that if something is important for a test, you should show it in the test case. If something is not important, hide it. So in this case, I don't care about the time. I don't care about the date. I just want to say it's 101 milliseconds. That is. And of course, you can do time span from milliseconds or something. I just prefer this. Yeah. It's just the small things. It's purely taste.
So are there other examples you have besides the date time stuff and the time span from int32 or
Do I have
other little
others?
helpers? I guess what I'm getting at is there other helpers that are one, this is a two-part question. Are they part of the Fluent Assertions package, i.e. they're only
Yes.
helpers for testing, or do you think it's worthwhile to pull some of those extension methods out for convenience so other people might be able to use those without?
Actually, people have asked for that. Yeah, that specific package for the daytime. That's funny. I hope it wasn't you, but somebody actually asked, like, can you actually move it in a separate package? We probably will do that at some point. Maybe with version 7. Well, no, that's not really the issue. It's more like, yeah, we have some ideas. Like, for example, we have support for data sets and that kind of stuff, which is kind of something that we regret accepting as a contribution. It's pretty specialized, so we prefer really to have people build their own libraries. So there's a lot of Fluent Assertions.mvc, Fluent Assertions.autofac. So people basically build their own package. We have a bunch of them which are kind of part of the Fluent Assertions organization, but maintained by several people. And I like my libraries to be lean and mean, do one thing,
I agree
have
with
as
that.
little dependencies. And yeah, this one, of course, Fluent Assertions has now a dependency on .NET Framework. Also some specific packages. So yeah, I think dataset is not something I use quite often. Nobody does, I suppose, at least. So let's move it into a separate package. Because that's also the issue. Like if you look at dependencies of the library, we want to have as little dependencies as possible. And if you look at assemblies, packages, yeah, you actually have some stuff there.
Interesting.
Which we prefer not to have. Like system.data. At some point, people had to manually add system.data because of this dataset thing. And if they upgrade it, so we really try to follow semantic versioning so that you can always take, if you have some 6 point something version, you can always upgrade to the latest 6 point something because we guarantee backwards compatibility, both on the binary level as well as on the source level.
Awesome. Yeah. I got one question here before we close out because we're getting close to time.
Oh, wow.
What do you have like an extensibility model so that if I wanted to take your base package and then say just add a custom assertion rule, for example, is that something I could do?
Yes, there's an entire section in the documentation. I don't know why it's displaying all this stuff all the time. Where that goes all the way from the beginning to the end, explaining how you can build your own shoots, how you can actually use the internal engine. There's an engine called Assertion, which you can build also, again, using Fluent APIs internally, that you can build your own extensions so that they get the same behavior, the same way they report messages. They work together with this assertion scope that I showed you earlier. Goes quite far. It also explains you can scope, also how to format things. So you can build your own formatter, how to render the output with examples of that. So if Fluent Assertions, if you compare a graph, then also needs to know how do I render a time span? How do I display a string or a dictionary? And you can extend all of that. How you deal. So everything is actually there.
Awesome.
The whole thing.
This has been great. Thank you so much.
One last question, just one, because I bet it's a quick one. Do we have any support for attributes for UI testing?
Yes, there's a bunch of tests that actually use the UI fact to. You can actually see that. There's a bunch of things that actually work with the UI facts. But I have to correct myself. Pure UI testing, no. But actually, people are using these things like UI fact and STA fact to run some of the components with Fluent Assertion. That works because that's what people want to have that. I haven't done that myself. It's purely contributed. I think we even use STA fact somewhere. So you see like this extension library, which is supposed to be used, but you see these UI fact things. Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. But again, thank you to Dennis for sharing
You're welcome.
Hour of his day with us. That was amazing. I learned a lot. Also, a big thank you to all of our viewers, both loyal and new. As a reminder, for the last hour, you've been watching the On.NET live show. We stream each and every Monday, hopefully, in this same location. We hope to see you next week, where we'll welcome a Microsoft MVP, Tomas Hersig. He'll actually join the show to talk about .vvm, which is an MVVM-based web framework. As a final reminder, please do check out dot.net/live, where you'll find other .NET-focused live streams and videos like the one you watched today. Again, thank you, everybody, and hope to see you next week.
Bye, friends.
Goodbye.